Hi, Farhana.
Hi, Aziz.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. It's great to be on
Excellent.
Blogging Heads.
Same here. So my name is Farhana Khera. I'm the president and executive director of Muslim Advocates. We're a national legal advocacy and educational organization.
And my name is Aziz Huq. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Before I came to Chicago, I worked as an attorney doing civil rights and civil liberties work at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU for about 5 years. So Farhana and I today are going to talk about some of the issues arising around the increasing amount of anti-Muslim bias evident in the US and in the media. We're gonna set the groundwork at first by talking a little bit about the facts, and then turn to some explanations about why we might be seeing this trend, and then round things out by talking about some of the things that people are doing or could be doing to address it. So do you want to start off, Farhana, by talking a little bit about the experience of your organization, Muslim Advocates, and what you've seen over the last few years?
Sure. You know, and our organization was created in the aftermath of the tragic events of 9/11, and it was created by a group of Muslim American lawyers who came together very concerned about not only the rights of and the future of Muslims in America, but more fundamentally, the state of affairs in terms of our state of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and a recognition that it's taken a generation of Americans time and time again to come forward and step forward and defend those founding values of our country. And what we have been seeing at Muslim Advocates over the last year has been a disturbing rise in anti-Muslim sentiment. There was, unfortunately, the beginnings of some of this anti-Muslim rhetoric in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It had been percolating in society, and particularly in the extreme fringes of the blogosphere. But what we noticed last year and beginning last summer was now that anti-Muslim sentiment was now starting to move from the extreme reaches of the blogosphere to mainstream media, to mainstream public discourse in very disturbing and tragic ways.
And it may help people to see what you're talking about if we talk about a couple of examples of what that means. So one pretty recent example is the set of statements made by one of the presidential candidates at a recent presidential debate, Mr. Herman Cain. Cain at a recent debate said that he wouldn't have Muslims in his cabinet because he didn't believe they were trustworthy. Now, if you think a little bit about that statement and try and put into that same statement any other ethnic or religious group, be it African Americans, Jews, Latinos, I think you immediately see that it would be a statement that made about any other group would lead to a person's exclusion and expulsion from any kind of mainstream political organization. But what was striking about what Cain said was not so much the fact that he said it, but the fact that there was basically zero response from any of the other debaters, or really that much response from the mainstream media about the statement that said about any other group would have been utterly out of bounds.
And I think, Aziz, just to put a finer point on why Herman Cain's comments were so disturbing was it had echoes in American history, and very specifically the way in which Catholic and Jews have had their loyalty tested. When, for example, then presidential candidate John F. Kennedy was running for office, and people wondered aloud whether his loyalty would be to the Vatican or to the Constitution in the United States. So it has very disturbing echoes of that past history in which we certainly hoped that our country had learned from those past mistakes. But this is really a very disturbing sign that there are some who would like to revisit some of those darker chapters of our history. And we really need more Americans stepping forward and saying, this is wrong. It's not who we are as Americans. It has no place in political debates and policy discourse, especially with all of the very serious challenges facing our country today.
And I think it's important also to say that this isn't something that you just see at the level of relatively elite media discourse. It's also something that you see on the ground. So as part of my research, I've been looking into some of the metrics of ambient discrimination by members of the public against American Muslims. And the trend line is startling. What you see is that there is a spike in reported hate crimes, in reported instances of employment discrimination immediately after 9/11. And for obvious reasons, that may not be surprising, even if it is regrettable. That spike tailors downward, slopes downward, up through 2005, 2006, 2007. And then in the last couple of years, what we have seen is a rise in levels of employment discrimination, at least as it's reported to the EEOC, which is the federal agency responsible for such questions. We've seen a rise in reported instances of hate attacks, at least with respect to those national groups, Muslim groups that keep track of that data. And we've seen increasing numbers of public opinion surveys by Pew, by Gallup, by Fox, among others, that show surprisingly resurgent levels of animus and distrust of Muslims, far above and beyond what you saw even in 2004, 2005.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Aziz. And, I would also note that this is not just the data that the community is coming forward with, but this is the government's own data. So it's even the FBI's own hate crime statistics show that hate crimes motivated by anti-Muslim bias remain much higher than levels pre-9/11. And I would also add to what you were describing is a disturbing trend towards opposing the construction or renovation of mosques in places around the country. And it's, according to, again, the Justice Department's own statistics, they've seen an increase in complaints that they've received by Muslim communities across the country, in which those communities have experienced unreasonable opposition to their desire to build a house of worship. And as you know, Aziz, religious freedom, the freedom to practice one's faith, has been a not only, it's at the core of who we are as Americans, and the reason that some of the first settlers came to the country and founded the United States. So this is really a very disturbing issue. And in fact, the Justice Department, a very senior Justice Department official, has said that they believe this rise in complaints is directly related to an increase in the anti-Muslim sentiment that you were describing earlier.
And it's certainly part of the media story, whereby images and arguments about the nature of Islam get propagated out to a broader public in ways that may lead to bias attacks. And I'm thinking here in particular of the brouhaha, the controversy around the Park 51 mosque, which became a platform. The protests about the cultural center became a platform for making claims about what Islam is, about who American Muslims are, many of which were patently without any basis in fact, but which were repeated verbatim by the media over and over again. Led on top of a narrative about this cultural center that in many ways was extremely misleading. The sort of claims about, well, this is being built at 9/11, it's being built as a way of insulting the memories of those who died on that tragic day. A group of people, by the way, who included many Muslims from countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, who happened to be working in the towers early on that morning in September 2001, and became focal points, I think, that inspired, in the most regrettable kind of way, the anti-mosque campaign in places like Tennessee and Illinois. We've seen it, that's really ongoing around the country. And it's also inspired, as you know, Farhana, this wave of so-called anti-Sharia legislation that I know you've been following.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And just to put a finer point on this in terms of how absurd it's gotten, even just speaking of the Murfreesboro, Tennessee case that you were referencing, Aziz, the opponents of the mosque construction project have gone so far to say that Islam is not a religion. And the Justice Department had intervened in that case and had to file a brief, not only defending the community's right to build a house of worship, but stating no, Islam is a religion.
Yeah,
and it should enjoy the protections of the First Amendment. So, but you mentioned the Sharia ban efforts, which also are similarly rooted in this absurdity. When I first heard about the Oklahoma ballot initiative that passed last November, my immediate reaction was I just couldn't believe how silly and absurd it was. It really is an example of a solution in search of a problem.
And just to be clear, the law, what the amendment to Oklahoma's constitution would do, and right now it's being enjoined by a federal court, but what it would do if it came into effect is to bar any state court from taking account of an argument or a claim, quote unquote, based upon Sharia law. And really the only effect that would have, realistically speaking, is to prohibit people from enforcing contracts that refer to Islamic law terms, such as halal, or contracts that are written in the finance context to avoid the payment of interest or riba. So what this would do is really not anything more or anything less than close off the courts to the enforcement of private agreements for a class of people defined by their religion.
Right. And, and just to add to that, that's the impact of it, which I'm glad you explained that in detail, Aziz. And I think there's a lot of confusion about what Sharia is and what the impact is. And I just want to make it clear that there has never been a credible claim of any group of Americans seeking to assert Sharia to overturn the Constitution or our political system. Since the founding of our country, in fact, Muslims have fought and died defending the Constitution and our legal and political system. So all of this is really just a bunch of hooey. It's designed to spread fear, suspicion, and to pit one group of Americans against another. And frankly, it seems to be done to be motivated by, a desire to score political points.
Absolutely, and that's, I think, why we can expect to see more of these anti-Sharia bans appearing not just on the statute books, but on referenda and initiative questions in 2012. The predictable effect of that kind of referendum question, that kind of inflammatory, ill-informed, and derogatory measure, we know from the Oklahoma context is to raise predictably voter turnout, particularly among religiously conservative Republicans. And so from the perspective of some operatives of political parties, it's worth defaming a religious group in order to score political points, in order to get a slight edge at the poll. And thankfully there are many people in that political party and other political parties who think that kind of tactic in the political domain is really undesirable. It's really wrong.
Right. Oh, I think that's right. And all of these efforts are really just so unnecessarily redundant of the supremacy clause of the Constitution. And Aziz, I know you're the constitutional legal expert, but and you can correct me here.
Yeah, well, don't get me started.
But the supremacy clause has certainly protected our country since its founding from to ensure that the Constitution is the law of the land and protects it from any religious law, any foreign law. It will never trump the Constitution. So again, just to underscore what you were saying earlier, that this is really it's just absurd. It's nonsensical.
And maybe one other element of the Oklahoma Sharia initiative and the Part 51 controversy that's worth drawing out is this deeply ironic claim that lies at the bottom of both proposals: the proposal to ban Sharia law in Oklahoma, the proposal to prevent the building of this cultural center in Lower Manhattan. This is the idea that that Islam is I've seen language like it's a violent death cult, or it's purely a jihadi faith, or what have you. I say that this is ironic because what the advocates of these measures have done is to look at the most twisted, perverted, violent, and I'll come out and say it, evil form of view of the faith, a view that's put forward by groups like Al-Qaeda and people like Bin Laden, and to say that, well, this is the faith, this is what it is, and to ignore the fact that there are millions of Muslims in the United States, millions and millions more in the world today, that this is a faith that goes back almost a millennium and a half. Just like any other world religion, it's a faith that's extremely varied. It's a faith that's extremely diverse, and to be sure, it has engendered over time violent factions, as has Christianity, as has Judaism, as indeed has Buddhism, to pick a faith which violence is usually not connected to. But the overwhelming majority, in the 99.99 percentile range of Muslims today and historically, have eschewed these kinds of political violences. And by taking what is truly exceptional, both numerically and historically, as being representative of a faith, in a way that maligns and that inaccurately casts the lived experience of literally millions of people, these groups are actually furthering a goal of the terrorist organizations. The terrorist organizations that want to say ours is the true faith. So you have this very perverse and ironic dynamic where the faction that claims to be most pro-security, in fact, is propagating the message that the threats to security wish to disseminate to the general public.
Right. And I would say, just adding to that last point, Aziz, is the way in which these anti-Muslim forces are also feeding into the Al-Qaeda narrative by basically feeding this idea that Muslims have no place in the West, in America, in modern democratic societies. And that's part of the Al-Qaeda recruiting narrative, to try to recruit Muslims from the West as well. So you're absolutely right about that. The irony of what these elements and forces are doing, it really does not only tear at our country in terms of the social fabric, it really does add to really creating a national security concern as well for our country.
Right, and one of the parts of my research here at the University of Chicago has involved looking at how changing experiences of private discrimination and public discrimination by the police and investigative authorities alters people's responses and behaviors toward the law and police. And we know actually from years and years of empirical research that when people are treated unfairly by the police, they're less likely to cooperate with the police in the future. And doing studies in the last 2 years of both Muslim Americans and non-Muslim Americans, what we have found is that the same effect is true in the terrorism context, so that experiences of both private discrimination and also official discrimination or unfairness lead people within the Muslim American community to avoid contact with the police. And this, by the way, is a dynamic that you see across different ethnic groups, across different religious groups. Whites, blacks, and Latinos all show the same kind of behavior. So it's not surprising if an organization or an institution treats you unfairly, you tend to avoid it. What we also find, and this is, I think, especially telling, is that when non-Muslims see or perceive Muslims to be the subjects of discrimination, they tend to cooperate less with the police. They see the police as less fair, less legitimate, and therefore less worthy of cooperation and aid. So there's really a significant harm that is imposed upon police community relations, not just in American Muslim communities, but more broadly, when you have either a group that's being subjected to disparate treatment by the police, unfair treatment, singling out by law enforcement authorities, or private discrimination by members of the general public. And I think that those costs really have not been reckoned with. And again, this goes back to the irony of these arguments about what Islam is. Maybe right. Farhana, we can talk, or I can get your opinion about why you think this is happening now. I mean, these are trends that seem to have ebbed for a couple of years since 9/11, but now there seems to be this renewed rise in anti-Muslim feeling in the U.S.
Yeah. I think there are probably multiple factors at play. It seems to me that it's probably a combination of, number one, the kinds of things I think you were referencing, Aziz, which is it's now been almost 10 years of the public being essentially told by law enforcement, by government officials, to be suspicious of their Muslim neighbors, of the mosque down the street. And that starts to actually permeate the conscious when people know that the FBI is monitoring the mosques in their communities, asking questions about their coworkers or neighbors who happen to be Muslim, happen to be Arab, but have not engaged in any wrongdoing, and or when they have friends who've been targeted for questioning at the airport or at borders when they're returning from overseas travel, being asked about their religious practices, charitable practices, again, with no link to any kind of terrorist activity. I think that starts to have an impression on people. I think another major factor at play that I think we can't ignore is politics, and that we do have a president who does have a Muslim middle name, and there seems to be an effort to continue to try to paint Islam in a negative light, and to try to paint the president and associate him with Islam, again for electoral gain. Especially with 2012 and the elections just around the corner. So, those are a couple of key things that come to mind.
I guess I would throw in the economy into that picture, in as much as I read the data, the real change in sentiment starts to get picked up around 2007 and 2008, which is when the financial crisis really took off and started to have substantial effects on people's lives, when the housing market started to collapse, when the infirmity in the job market started to become more evident. And it's hard to prove this, but in other circumstances, in other historical and geographic circumstances, it's often the case that economic insecurity, the feeling that your way of life is under threat, will lead people to look for scapegoats to blame, look for agents to attribute the harm to. And I think we see that with Muslims. I think we actually see it with immigrants more generally, which is why you've seen a much broader turn toward a negative view of migration. Ironically, at a time when migration flows are actually decreasing because it's less attractive to come from Mexico to America because the economy in the United States is just not as good as it used to be. I think both the recent surge in anti-immigrant feeling and also this anti-Muslim sentiment, this tide of anti-Muslim sentiment, is likely to have something to do with economic trends. Although I absolutely agree with you that it's in part a kind of opportunistic bandwagoning around or in response to Obama becoming president and really kind of targeting his perceived foreign origins, his perceived sympathy to other countries' populations, as a way of tarring him as un-American, as if the Scotch Irish or the French Americans or the Scottish population or the American Scots population in Charlotte, North Carolina, don't also share some kind of heritage with a country from other than the United States.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. I agree with you. I think the economic factors are clearly at play as well in this growing anti-Muslim sentiment.
So, what kind of things ought to be done for Farhana? I mean, is this is this in kind of Rahm Emanuel terms? This is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity for the American Muslim community.
Well, I do think
you can become mayor of Chicago.
I do think it's interesting that while this has been a very tough time for American Muslims, something, by the way, that I hear from American Muslims over the last year has been perhaps a greater level of fear and anxiety than people experienced in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. I think the concern is that 10 years out, I think people thought that some of the people would certainly have learned a lot more about Islam. They would have a better understanding of their Muslim friends and neighbors, and yet there seems to be an uptick in these kinds of hateful activities. So I think there's a lot of very deep concern, and so but at the same time, something that's been really heartening is also the number of Americans who've been coming forward, who've basically been saying enough is enough. These are Americans from all walks of life, all different faith backgrounds. We're saying this is not who we are as a country, and we need to stand up for our shared values of freedom, truth, fairness, and justice for all. And just to give you some examples of that extraordinary courage and leadership, there have been a number of faith leaders from the Jewish community, Christian communities, Catholic communities. I had the opportunity to testify at a Senate hearing in March on the issue of the state of civil rights of the American Muslim community, and Cardinal Theodore McCarrick was one of the individuals who also testified very eloquently about how this is wrong, and it is an unfortunate reminder of some darker chapters in our history when religious or ethnic or racial groups have been targeted. So it's been very heartening to see Americans step forward. I think the other role to play is government. I think whether it's government officials, I think individual government officials have a responsibility, frankly, to refrain from using hateful and divisive rhetoric, and a responsibility to call out those in their party who do engage in this type of hateful and divisive rhetoric.
And I think that it's not just something that applies to people in the executive branch, right? It's something that applies to legislators too.
Yes.
Becoming a legislator is a public trust.
Yes.
And it's easy to abuse that public trust by using your bully pulpit to stake up fear and anxiety, which imposes real harms on people. And it's really a trust that if it's breached, other legislators ought to come down really hard on that person.
Yeah. And I would say not just legislators and executive branch officials at the federal level, but even the state and local level as well. There was an incredibly unfortunate incident earlier this year of a hate rally that took place in Orange County, California, outside of a fundraising event that was being held by a Muslim charitable organization. And it was actually a local city councilwoman who made some extremely hateful remarks, and it was effectively making a death threat against the individuals who were attending the fundraising event. And that was a local elected official. So this is, I think all officials, local, state, federal, have a responsibility here.
I have a bit of the reaction that I have toward the unfolding scandal about the News of the World in England to this, in the following sense that I look at my English compatriots. I'm a US and a UK citizen, and I think, gosh, you're all blaming the News of the World and the Murdochs and the editors of the News of the World and the like. But really, all of these people were responding to you, the newspaper buying public, who bought stories because they wanted to hear about the last words of Millie Dowling, the murdered 13-year-old. And at the end of the day, people have to take responsibility for the fact that if politicians or members of or people on the media think that they can build market share by making racist or biased arguments, it is on the people who watch the TV, who write checks to the relevant political party, who attend rallies, to vote with their feet, right? To go, maybe not to the other party, but maybe to the other channel, to the other candidate, to make it really clear that there's a reason that we in the United States have identified a set of boundary lines that political discourse is not supposed to cross. And one of those boundary lines is the idea that you don't stigmatize religious groups based upon anything, but let alone based upon the actions and beliefs of an incredibly small minority within that group, and use that minority's actions and beliefs, evil and wrong as they are, as an excuse to stigmatize and tarnish the entire group. And also to impose real harms on that group in their economic opportunities, in their ability to walk around safely, in their ability to participate in the political process.
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point, Aziz, and you've given some great examples of things that American people can do who are disgusted by this type of hateful activity.